Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 9 of The Argument Clinic, a Lincoln Douglas debate podcast for everyone. My name is Martin.
And I'm Lawrence.
And together, we have the number one Lincoln Douglas podcast in the United States that is run by Martin and Lawrence. We're just the absolute number one if you look at only that criteria and probably all the other criteria. Anyway, where in the world was Lawrence Zhao? Where in the world was Lawrence Zhao for the past 2 weeks? What have you been doing?
Trying to recover on sleep. So I've said this story probably a million times now, but I'll say it again. So 2 weeks ago was finals week, which if you're in college, which most of you who are listening to this podcast, I would assume are not, finals week is a time where you feel bad for sleeping because you feel like you should be studying for finals, but you don't really want to study for finals. So you just stay up until like 2 a.m. every morning watching television or Netflix. So I didn't get any sleep that week. And then this last week, I was sleeping on the floor of my apartment because I was letting my sister stay the week with me. So she got the bed. So I was sleeping on the floor, and which meant that I was waking up like 8 times a night because floors are not very comfortable. So I've basically just been dying the last 2 weeks.
Wow, Lawrence. So about that finals week thing, are you familiar with the term projection?
I have like a slight recollection from like high school psychology, but
okay,
I don't actually know what it is anymore.
No reason. And that's nice that you were sleeping on the floor. I have been doing basically nothing. I've slept on a bed. I've played trading cards. It was great. I played a bunch of a video game. It was glorious. So basically nothing. Lawrence got up to all sorts of no good though. Okay, so
watching like multiple seasons of Netflix shows.
Probably.
Yes.
So before we get into the substance of the podcast, I'd like to give a shout out to Victory Briefs, the great summer debate camp institute that has decided to fund our lovely podcast. They are excellent. You should consider going to them for camp if you haven't made final decisions about that. And you should definitely go to victorybriefs.com to check out the various websites that they have there. Which one is the news site? Is that like victorybriefsdaily.com or something?
The blog is vbriefly.com. So
vbriefly.
Yeah.
Okay. So do that. Thank you to everyone who sent us an email about our last episode, and we got some Reddit messages from a couple people who do that thing. So that was awesome. Got a chance to hook up some people with some sweet literature. And I feel like I'm begging for this, but iTunes reviews, could we like have some of those? Anyway, thanks. So now the substance of the episode. This is the social contract episode. It's a scholarship episode. We're going to discuss all of the ins and outs of the social contract, which is one of the most basic philosophical arguments that's present in Lincoln Douglas debate and has been for the better part of 30 years. And it's been one of the most important philosophical traditions in modern philosophy in the last 400 years. So that's some pretty good stuff. Lawrence, how much do you love the social contract?
With all of my heart, which is to say not very much, but as much as I can.
When people say it with all of their heart, do they mean like particular like valves?
I mean, I don't really know what people mean when they say I love it with all of my heart. I just try to emulate what other people do in society.
I mean, it seems like you're just reserving like 0 of your heart for any other activity. That's just like very, very silly. If you're just like, man, I love these Olive Garden breadsticks with all of my heart, then it's like, the pasta comes out. It's like you have no more heart to give. You screwed up. All right. Okay, so when we get back from the following brief jazz break, we will discuss what the social contract theory is, and then after a break after that, we'll discuss how you would debate it. So in this first section, we'll get into the social contract theory and sort of generally what it is. Spoiler alert, it's like fairly detailed. There are a bunch of different parts of it. And we understand that in order to succeed in Lincoln Douglas debate, that you all have maybe a working knowledge of some elements of the social contract, but many of you are not familiar with some of the more intricate details of the social contract, sort of the overall theory behind it, its pedigree, and stuff like that. But understanding those issues can be really important to demonstrating mastery in a debate round, to proving that you have a greater understanding of a good philosophical issue than your opponent. And it can really give you insights into ways of responding to certain types of framework arguments. Lawrence, do you have anything to say about why it might be good to learn about the social contract, or just like general quips that you want to hit the listeners with?
So the social contract is probably the most single influential, form of thinking, philosophical thinking in the last 400 years. In fact, there's just been like there's actually a bunch of quotes from different philosophers who are like, America has had trouble escaping the sort of social contract basis of most of the thinking in philosophy, especially given the heavy influences of contemporary social contract theory on American government, like John Locke's particular theory of how government ought to run and its direct influence upon many people who drafted the documents that form the basis of the United States government.
Yeah, if you read the Declaration of Independence, by the way, and then you like read a random like section of Locke, it's very, very difficult to tell the difference if you didn't already know what it was.
Yeah, and I mean, independent of that as well, I mean, even like most of the modern sort of liberal thinking in philosophy, so for example, John Rawls and Robert Nozick being the two most prominent examples of contemporary American thinking, draw very heavily upon social contract basis for their arguments, and I would guess most American philosophies do as well. So even if you don't care very much for Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Hume and those other people, knowing what they say is really important for like building upon further philosophical thought and understanding current philosophical thought.
I also don't know what part of debate social contract theory does not touch. Like in traditional debate,
Yeah,
it's like very, very prevalent. In circuit debate, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but like in progressive styles of debate, social contract theory has made a real resurgence, which is sort of funny. And then in debates in front of parents, it's just a kind of a very easy thing to explain.
yeah. I mean, it's just so heavily ingrained in our way of thinking about political philosophy that it's just nearly impossible to escape. Like if you ask just regular people, like, what do you think a just government is? Most likely their answer will be like, why did you ask me that question? But if then you probe further, and their answer will almost always fall something along the lines of the social contract.
Yeah. So when you say that it's like ingrained and stuff, does that mean it's like inside of the grain?
Are we really doing this, Martin? Really?
I'm just like wondering where the phrase ingrained came from. Like actually. Just like where?
How about someone tells us in the comments, because I'm too lazy to look over my other computer and Google this.
Well, thanks, Lawrence. Okay, so ruining my fun. Okay, so first thing you guys need to understand about the social contract theory is kind of like what sort of type of thing that it is. Very broadly, it is what's called a theory of government. It's a theory of how the government was founded. It's a theory of the legitimacy of the government. It's not like it's not a history of the government, but it is just a way of explaining how the government works. This stems from a sort of fundamental thing, which is that the government is very complex. In order to understand the way that the government works in relation to the people, it's different in a lot of places, but it is also enormously complicated. And frequently throughout history, people have run into the question of like, why is the government good? What is the basis for the government? Why does it exist? Is it just like these group of people that just rule us with an iron fist because they have more power than us? If so, how are they legitimate? There have been all sorts of theories throughout history to try to explain the government, why it exists, how it could be warranted. And the social contract theory is one of those theories. So I noticed that there's a quote that's been put in the show notes. Lawrence, would you mind explaining this?
Yeah, so this quote is taken from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy because I find it to be one of the more concise explanations of the social contract. And in fact, many of the things that we'll talk about can be elaborated further upon this article, as well as articles concerning the specific philosophers we're talking about from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. as well as the original works, but you can read those if you want. The quote is the quote is basically a description of what the social contract is in its broadest terms, and it is, quote, persons' moral and or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement among them to form the society in which they live. And that is the basic description of what the social contract is.
Before we unpack some of those more specific terms about sort of social contract part of that, I did want to establish that. So the social contract is a theory that tries to explain the relationship between the people and the government, right?
Yeah, and with people and other people as well.
So first and foremost, the thing that's important to realize is that on resolutions that do not really involve the government acting, and a lot of them involve government action in some capacity, but a lot of them don't. So in the resolutions that don't involve governments, the social contract theory loses a lot of its force, right?
Or at least the political portion of it that we're mainly discussing here. Like certainly you could talk about other contract-based theories that explain sort of what obligations individuals have within a society. But I guess for the purpose of this podcast, we'll mostly be discussing the sort of government or the state's role in a social contract.
Okay. Now let's get into some of those things that you talked about. So first and foremost, let's unpack each of those words. So a social contract. Social obviously refers to society writ large. And contract is an agreement. Many of you might think of a legal document that you would sign. And a contract is a promise. A contract says, I promise to do something. In exchange, you promise to do this other thing. And a contract is a written or otherwise agreement that is binding upon us. So, for example, when you agree to pay someone money for a house or something like that, or you agree to work for someone, that's an agreement, and then they agree to pay you in return. If they don't pay you, you can sue them. If you don't work, they can sue you / fire you. So it is an agreement. Now, what does it mean, Lawrence, that this agreement, this promise is social? How can you have a social promise?
What do you mean by that?
So it's a little strange to have a contract kind of with yourself or across someone. Like I can understand making a contract with like my employer or like sort of like a physical entity, but it seems kind of weird like that you would have a contract and that contract would be to everyone in society. Like that seems a little odd was what I was getting at. And I guess I can just be really smart and answer my own question. The idea of a social contract is that citizens make agreements with all other citizens. Everyone agrees to do something. Everyone agrees to constrain the things that they are and are not allowed to do. And one point that I think is really helpful to understand about the social contract is kind of like, what is its foil? What are we comparing the social contract to, Lawrence? Or let me put this a different way. The social contract is a theory of government. Because part of the thing about a theory of government is that you're comparing it to a world of no government, right?
Yeah.
Right. So can you describe what most social contract theorists think of as the no government situation? Like, what's that called?
So they would call it the state of nature, and we'll talk way more about this when we discuss each particular philosopher's view on the state of nature. But the general idea is the state of nature is the sort of natural state of man that does not contain an organized system of governance to sort of control and facilitate interactions between other people in society. And that sort of forms the basis by which government arises. And we'll discuss that in greater detail later.
And so, state of nature, situation before government.
Yeah.
Now, the general idea, correct me if I'm wrong, with pretty much all of the forms of the social contract is that so people who are in the state of nature, this by the way is the general story that you all can use to describe kind of any generic social contract argument. The general idea is a thing in the state of nature were bad. In the state of nature, people had, and we've discussed this on many other podcasts, but if you're just tuning in for the first time or you haven't listened to our other episodes, there's a distinction here between negative and positive rights that I kind of just want to briefly explain. A positive right is the ability to go out and do a thing, and the negative right is the right to not have something done to you. So you have a negative right against being murdered, and you have a positive right to go and buy a sundae at the shop, in the sense that the government can't stop you from doing that. So you have the right to go out and do stuff. You also have the right to not have stuff done to you. Okay, so with that distinction out of the way, the general idea is that in the state of nature, people, and this is a way of thinking about it, have basically infinite positive rights. Before a government, when you're sort of floating around, when you're just in kind of think like a tribal situation, right? People can do whatever they want. There are no laws. And as a consequence of that, everyone can do whatever they want to do. But also it means that nobody has any restrictions on what they can do to you. You don't have any restrictions on what you can do, but no one has any restrictions on what they can do either. So when you conflict, it's just like who's stronger wins. So if I wanted a thing, right, I could go and get that thing. But if you just stab me in the back or whatever, there's no I guess justice for that. It's just like not a thing that is important.
Or maybe not no justice, but rather that justice becomes relatively arbitrary because it depends on your ability to organize a stronger response to them, or to have, like, for example, be part of a larger tribe that is able to defend you against an aggressor, or yourself be physically stronger than your aggressor and capable of defending yourself, as opposed to based merely on the sort of moral, like, goodness or badness of the action.
Yeah, and that kind of sucks because it means that you're in a perpetual state of insecurity. None of your rights are being respected. Things are just really bad. You can just be killed at any time. You can go and do really bad stuff. But that obviously is not a very moral situation. Now, the sort of founding of a government, and again, the story is different. I'm just not going to say that anymore. The story is just going to be different, basically. But here's the underlying theme. People all decide that this is a very bad situation. So what they do in response is they agree to give up some of their positive rights so that they get corresponding negative rights. I'm going to say that again. They give up some of their positive rights, for example, to go out and murder whoever they want, in exchange for some negative rights, aka you have the right to not be murdered whenever they want. You give up the rights to do some stuff, but also those people can't do that thing to you. And that is why it's a social contract. It's a contract with everyone. Everyone agrees to not do a thing to anybody else. So it's kind of like a mutual agreement among everyone. Mutual because it applies in every direction. I agree not to do this to you. You agree not to do this to me. And Lawrence, what is the sort of thing that enforces that?
So call it what you want: the sovereign, the government, the state, the political, whatever you want. Some body of people, persons that has been imbued with power by the people to sort of collectively enforce their rights that they've all agreed to protect.
Yeah, so the sovereign is what a lot of these people call it. And I wanted to very quickly talk about the sovereign, and I'm not sure how this differs in some of the accounts I'm going to describe below, but this is my understanding, at least, of our first gentleman Hobbes's sovereign. And I want you, Lawrence, to correct me if you think that I'm wrong about whether or not this does or does not apply to Locke or Rousseau. But so a sovereign is what's called a corporate body, and that is just like an English word, corporate here. People think corporations, and a corporation is a corporate body, but overall, a corporate body is a group that kind of becomes one entity, and it kind of acts as if it is a person in that entity. And a corporation is obviously a perfect example of this, and that's where the word comes from. Like, corporations can act as legal persons. They can sue other corporations in court. They act as a person, but it's really just a group of people. And they agree amongst themselves, they make decisions, and they do stuff, and they kind of act in tandem. The idea of the sovereign is that the sovereign is the people's corporate body. The people sort of vest authority in this thing, the sovereign. And for Hobbes, the sovereign is just everyone. Everyone is part of the sovereign because they are the ones making the agreement, they're the ones enforcing the agreement, etc. Now, the thing is, obviously, like, it's not like a direct democracy situation, but the idea is that the sovereign then authorizes people to act on its behalf, and those people are in various different countries, like the government, for example. Lawrence, does that sound about right to you? That's my understanding from college.
So yeah, that seems
sovereign.
Mostly correct for Hobbes. I guess there might be a slight distinction in terms of Locke, because Locke sort of views the government as a few separate different entities, as evidenced in his book, Two Treatises of Government, where he writes chapters on the specific different parts of it. But I guess he would agree ultimately that they sort of collectively act together and sort of have the agency of a single moral agent, i.e. the singular government. And as for Rousseau, Rousseau's views are, I guess, a little bit more complicated, so we'll get to those a little bit later.
Yeah, but one thing that I wanted to say, so the social contract theory explains how the government comes about, sort of, right? It says the government comes about as a result of a contract, an agreement, a mutual agreement between people in society to not have to live in the state of nature anymore, because that sucks. Now, but one thing that I wanted to make sure that we understand is that by the sovereign, although a lot of times the sovereign will kind of end up looking like the government, those things are not identical, right? The sovereign is the people's will kind of formed together. And then that can authorize a group to act on its behalf. But it's not like the sovereign is just whatever government happens to exist. It's just that the government is authorized as sovereignty, which, by the way, if you've heard that term in an international relations context, just comes from this context. It has sovereignty insofar as it's kind of executing the authorization of the people. So if your opponent is just like, the sovereign is like, the sovereign is, I don't know, if you're in England, like Theresa May or something like that, that is the sovereign. It's like, no, not really. Like, Theresa May is not the sovereign in the sense that these people are talking about. The sovereign is like the group of people in, Britain that embody it with collective power. They can, vest authority in a government to authorize it to do things. Now, I've been saying to do things. So what exactly does the government do? Like, so like state of nature, Lawrence, right, is bad. It has a bunch of things that happen that aren't so good. So what does the government do about that?
Well, so it writes down and distributes and makes well known a series of common rules and laws that people should be reasonably able to follow. It is able to collect property from the people in order to keep functioning, and it is able to deploy agents on its behalf to make sure that the effective enforcement and consistent enforcement of the laws that is distributed are enforced. And that's really, to some extent, basically all that the government is really supposed to do. I think most of these, yeah, I mean, like, it seems like most of these social contract philosophers, at least the very basis core justification for a government, doesn't really extend beyond that, because again, they're sort of writing in contrast to a state of nature, which is like, state of nature sucks, you can violate other people's rights, that's really bad. So what do? We establish a government to stop people from violating those rights by making known a series of common laws that we get to enforce by taking property from you, to assign agents to enforce those laws. And beyond that, really, that there are other things that I guess the government can do, but that is really the core function of the government, at least.
When you say like take property from you, you mean like tax you?
Yeah, right. They can tax you. But I mean, like, for example, like Hobbes might be willing to say, like, you should give up your house to quarter some soldiers. So, it's a bit dependent.
Funny story. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but I actually ran a case in a debate about quartering soldiers at the CFL national tournament.
What did it say?
It said that So the resolution was worded in a very silly manner, and it said, it just said every constitutional right should be given to everyone on United States soil. And it was clearly like intending to be about immigrants. So like one of my cases was just like, oh, like immigrants who are being detained, like they like lose their rights and it exploits them and whatever. And but one of the cases that I had, because I thought it was hilarious, was it just specified down, it used the Third Amendment as the example, which is the no quartering troops amendment. And then it just said that like the Constitution already said that that was given to all people on U.S. soil. So the Constitution just affirmed. I also found this hilarious card that said that. So this is a huge tangent, but whatever. It's really funny. So there was I found this card that was actually I found as like an opening quote to a different article, but the card was like, look. There's basically no chance of anyone drawing and not drawing and quartering. That's a different thing and very violent. Just like quartering troops in soldiers' homes, he's like, yeah, basically no one's going to do this. We've really outgrown that as a society. However, if it happened, it would be really bad. And then it just like talked about why that was oppressive. And the really funny thing about that card was that it was from like 1886.
Oh my goodness.
That it was just so funny to me that there was this card that was like, yeah, I mean, basically we would never quarter troops anymore, and it's from like 1886. It's like hundreds of years ago. It was like, yeah, but if it happened, it'd be bad. I was like, yep, it'd be bad. That case was undefeated, depending on how you look at it. I read it in one debate round. Anyway, So what were we talking about? Something about like, oh yeah.
Let's just jump into Hobbes,
No. So I remember. So the government has to do some stuff.
Oh, right. Yes.
And
that part.
it has to like take your property. One important thing that you have to realize is that the whole point of the government is that it can do stuff to you that other citizens cannot do to you. So for example, Lawrence, do you think it would violate any laws if I kidnapped you and locked you in a cage in my basement and like occasionally fed you gruel?
I mean, in a general sense, yeah, it'd probably be illegal.
In a general sense,
you might be able to like rephrase it differently. Like, what if I rescued you from like hurricane while you were unconscious and like put you in the bottom of my basement waiting for help to arrive and occasionally fed me gruel and you just only had a cage
and locked me in a cage
for me to sit in, and it was for my own benefit because like I was injured and so you wouldn't want me to move around too much.
Oh man, I still think that would probably be illegal even in that case. So we call that kidnapping, boys and girls, and that's not allowed.
Fun time.
That's not allowed. Don't do it. And however, the government does that to people. The government puts them in this place called prison. I don't know if you've heard of it. And that is basically the government locking you in a cage and being like, here's some gruel. So the point is that when you enter into a society, you give up positive rights to the government. And one of those things is like also that the government in some sense gets some authority that it wouldn't otherwise have. The government has special privileges, right? It can pay people to walk around with sticks and hit you if you get too unruly. Those are called police. That was a very old-timey description of police with like.
You're letting your age show there, Martin.
Yeah, I'm just actually just like a 1901's like reporter. I don't know why I'd say 1901's. It's a 1 year. Okay, and one thing that I want to discuss before I get into the actual substance of Hobbes's theory. So we've given you a pretty good understanding of like the basic process that the social contract comes about. What is the sort of thing that it is? There is authority. You give up your positive rights. You get some negative rights. The government enforces stuff. It's a theory of the sovereign, not the government. We've explained all of those things. It's a theory of government. It explains the interrelationship between the people and the government. We've talked to you about the state of nature and what that is, and that really bad place before the government. Okay, but there's one thing that I want to talk about, and this is maybe a bit complicated, but I want you guys to follow with me on this. So we were talking about the social contract as if that was like a thing that exists. Lawrence, does the social contract, quote unquote, exist?
People have argued that sort of contemporary constitutions in westernized worlds do constitute a sort of social contract, but I guess in any idealized form.
In what sense are they a contract?
Yeah, in sort of the idealized form that these philosophers have forwarded, it does not exist in that exact sense.
So for example, like here is the kind of contract that maybe a skeptic would talk about the social contract as if it was. So imagine that I went over to your house, Lawrence, and I said, you owe me $5,000. And you said, what? No, I don't. And then I say, hey, I have this contract that says that if I jump up and down like and do 10 jumping jacks in my house every day for 10 days, you give me $5,000. I did the jumping jacks. Here's video evidence. And then you're just like, but I didn't agree to that.
Yeah, it's not a signatory party.
It's like, well, that's what the contract says. So you owe me $5,000. Right? Like the point is that that's not a contract, because a contract, remember, is a promise. And the thing about a promise is that it's a promise between two people. It's an agreement. And one of the things about an agreement is you have to agree, right? So part of the difficulty with the social contract is that like people don't agree to things. Like no one like walks into the government office and they're like, hey, here's a copy of the social contract for you to sign, like give up your, positive rights to murder and you get some negative rights not to be murdered. And I can't just be like, nope, that doesn't sound good to me. I'm not going to sign your contract. I'm going to go around murdering a bunch of people. It's like, no, you can't do that, obviously. But sort of like the contract is in some senses, it's not a real contract, right? Not a real contract.
Yeah, and I'll actually just go on a brief tangent here that sort of the modern day defense of like why the social contract is justifiable and how the government gets its legitimacy from the will of the people is, well, you sort of benefit from the doings of the state. For example, you benefit from its national security, you benefit from its infrastructure, from having like a fire department, et cetera, et cetera. And if you don't want that, I guess you can just sort of leave. And if you were to leave and renounce your citizenship, for example, that would constitute sort of you not abiding by this social contract. But other than that, there isn't a great defense, and this is why they have to rely on this concept of tacit consent, which is not necessarily going out and signing some contract that's like, I now give you, X government, legitimacy in my eyes, and I will follow your laws and I will pay you taxes. Tacit consent is really just consent that you sort of implicitly give to a government, basically just by remaining within the geographical confines of a state and agreeing to follow its laws, and that's basically it. So the problem, I guess, that
so I'm gonna interrupt you there. Like, correct me if I'm wrong. If this would be like a good sort of understanding of like tacit consent. So like, let's say I was like in your castle that was your house. I'm saying castle because I just want to imagine a place that's like pretty big, like very big. So I'm just like walking around. I'm kind of like a random like homeless dude in your castle, just kind of chilling. And then so there are these rules that are like listed on the board or whatever, and they're like, don't do this, have to do this. And in exchange, you can stay within these walls and no one will hurt you. And so I'm like, sweet. And I just like sort of walk around vagabonding my way, peddling cash, playing trading cards. And then like, after a couple months of this, someone shows up to me and they're like, hey, you have to do this thing. You're staying here. And you're like, hey, I didn't agree to that thing. It's like, well, you kind of did. the idea is that like you were there, you benefited from the things that you were supposed to benefit from. Just because you never like used your words to agree to it, you still agreed to it tacitly, right?
Right.
Like kind of on the DL, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
By
okay.
sort of enjoying the benefits that have been provided to you, you are under some sort of basic reciprocal obligation to provide or to give back to that institution. And the consent in this instance is entirely manufactured from the fact that you had the that you had the ability to leave, and that you willingly chose to stay and enjoy the benefits provided by this large castle, and that if at any point in time you felt that was not okay, that you could have freely left without interference by the castle.
Now, the tacit consent thing, though, that is designed to answer, that is designed to kind of answer an objection to the social contract, which is that, it's not a real contract because you didn't really sign it, like you didn't really agree to it. The idea is that you would have agreed to it. And that's designed to answer the objection that sort of government laws don't really have legitimacy because no one really signed them. But really, the important thing about consent and whether or not it exists is something else, I think. So now there is a theory that I want to introduce you all to, if you haven't already heard it, and it really is a set of theories, but this is kind of a good group of theories. So it's called contractarian. Contractarianism is a theory, and there are theories that are contractarian. Obviously, the social contract theory is one of those, but it is, contractarian obviously comes from the word contract, and the idea is that it is related to a contract. But the thing about a contractarianism that sort of makes it different from just straight up things that are like, contractarianism does not think, signing contracts or whatever is automatically the most moral thing. Like if you sign a contract that's like morally binding on you, etc. Like that's not what contractarianism really says. Contractarianism draws a very important distinction that I want you all to understand about the purpose of a contractarian theory and stuff like that. So if you recall, one thing that I said to you guys a bit earlier about the theory of government that is the social contract is that this is not a history of various societies, right, Lawrence? Like probably like no one can really name a modern society that kind of erupted at the state of nature, right?
And I guess one of those problems would be that if this were in fact an accurate historical depiction of how society arose, it would have arisen, pre-institution times, which is sort of before recorded history. So if this did happen, there's certainly no written record of it occurring.
Yeah, and there definitely like are not like any country that we would know today, right? Like is not been formed. It's like oh, like the United States was formed when, the citizens were in an anarchic state of nature killing each other, and then they decided to get together and give them a government with rights. It's like, that's not what happened. Like, they were colonists, they fought against Britain. Like, how was Britain founded? It's like, well, there were these Viking tribes, they conquered a bunch of people, they all settled down. It's like, there's basically no actual history that this explains. So, but the point of the social contract is not to explain where governments came from. It's designed to establish how a government could be legitimate, why a government is good. And I'm going to use an example of a different form of philosophy that I don't remember if we've talked about sort of Rawlsian arguments in the past. I think we have talked about the veil of ignorance, right? At some point?
Briefly mentioned.
Maybe. Okay.
Unsure about the depth of which we discussed it.
Contractarians do not think that people have signed a contract to become moral, or that contracts are somehow have, super binding moral force. But the contractarians have sort of discovered a truth about what it means for you to have agreed to something. The idea is, if you agreed to something, you think that thing is good. There are some, like, because for a lot of these people, like it wouldn't even be considered a contract. It wouldn't even really be a promise if it was like coerced, for example. That just wouldn't be an example of an agreement. So assuming an agreement was like uncoerced or whatever, you are expressing that this is a thing that you like. You're making a value judgment. You're agreeing that this is a good thing, this is a bad thing. I will accept the consequences of this action, etc. Now, it would say a lot about something that everybody would agree to it. So, for example, if I was like, hey, would you agree to like wave your hand at me for $100 or whatever? Then it's like, well, if everyone would agree to that, that says something about what people are doing. And in different contexts, like people are, make various contractarian arguments for like morality or whatever, and various different things. But the contractarian argument that I want to establish here is that the social contract theory is a contractarian theory of government. What it says is there is no actual contract. People never actually signed, quote unquote, the social contract. But the idea is that because that is an agreement that makes sense, giving up positive rights for negative rights, that can explain government legitimacy in governments that already exist. Does that make sense, Lawrence? It's like there are governments that already exist, and we can hold them to the standards of the social contract because the social contract theory makes sense as an explanation for government legitimacy. Because you would have agreed to this rule, it's a rule that we can impose upon you.
Yeah.
And so that's the important thing that I want to establish. This consent business is like sort of a red herring, right? Because it's not that you really consented, but it is that because you would have consented to a deal regarding government legitimacy, those are the rules by which legitimacy kind of is governed.
Right.
Okay. And one more thing, I know I keep saying that, before we get into the types of social contract theory, just one quick thing I wanted to highlight. So the social contract theory is a mutual agreement, right? I think a lot of times people think about the government's obligations to citizens and the citizen obligation to government. It's important that both of those things should be kept in mind. That, for example, the government not only has obligations to to the people, but the people also have an obligation to sort of like obey the general laws of the government. Sorry if that was like excessively brief or obvious. I just wanted that to be clear. That it is an agreement. If the government fails to fulfill some of its roles, or the people fail to fulfill some of its roles, the contract doesn't break because the contract doesn't really like exist, right? Because it's just a hypothetical thing. It doesn't actually exist. It's a hypothetical agreement. But like if the terms break down, if the government, for example, let's imagine a government that just stopped trying to protect its citizens. Like you would, have a very real sense in which the people sort of stop owing the government to do things anyway. Or that government is not really the sovereign anymore. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. At this point, I'm just sort of rambling. I've talked for a long time. So now let's go into the types of social contract theory. So Lawrence, would you like to discuss Hobbes' social contract theory?
Yes. So apparently, and I actually don't remember doing this, but I'm told by people who have watched this round that a quote that I made in the finals of Nationals in 2014 was something along the lines of Hobbes is stupid. You shouldn't listen to him. But despite the fact that I do think that sort of Hobbesian social contract doesn't really make too much sense, I'll do my best to sort of briefly explain a little bit about the background of Hobbes and his theories about a state of war, state of nature, etc. Is that Hobbes, he lived during a pretty tumultuous time, which there's like a bunch of fighting and revolutions, and he was sort of a political philosopher that occupied a ground that most people didn't have. So at this point in time, there was two current strands of thinking. One, that the government was legitimate because it was divine, because it had the sort of will of God behind it. And the other form of thinking, which was democratic, which is that a government is legitimate if the majority of the people within its territories and geographical boundaries consent to the practices of the government. Well, Hobbes was like, I don't really think either of these things are true, and instead develops his own version of political legitimacy. And this is based primarily off of his views of the state of nature. So most of you have probably at some point in time heard the sort of quote, like, life is nasty, brutish, and short. I don't actually, do you remember the actual quote like that it is? Or
It is that life in the state of nature. I don't know like what the buildup is, but the adjectives are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah. So basically that is.
By the way, very quick thing. I did, when I was reading a fantasy book, see someone describe a goblin as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which I thought was really funny.
Oh wow. Okay, so
short. That's funny.
So Hobbes's theory can be briefly broken up into two parts. So there's first his theorizations about human nature, and that informs his theorizations about the legitimacy of the government. So as you can guess from the above quote, his theorizations about human nature are not particularly great. He thinks that people sort of suck, they want to kill each other all the time, and this is kind of informed by the historical period in which he lives, in which there is constant war, revolutions, fighting. So he kind of sees human nature as just like wanting to fight and kill everyone else. And his thought is that if there wasn't a government, then everyone would just be fighting and trying to kill each other all the time, and that would be a state of war, where people's liberty and life are never secure because they can always be taken away by some other stronger force that decides that they just want to kill other people because it's fun for them or whatever. And his other insight into human nature, other than it being like really crappy, is that people are rationally self-interested, and that they really just do what is best for themselves, and that they really don't care about other people. It's always a secondary concern to promoting their own self-interest, which is like generally just having a better life and like not dying.
And so
with this in mind,
Hobbes is very low on humans.
Oh yeah, no, humans suck. They're the worst. You shouldn't trust them with anything.
So there's a huge, part of Hobbes's book, which by the way is called Leviathan.
Yeah, which alone the title should tell you about what he feels about government.
Yeah, that by the way is one of the coolest book names ever. I also recently looked at it on Google Scholar, and it has like, 18,000 something citation, like people cited it that many times, which is a pretty epic number. And so Hobbes has a huge section in his book on human nature, right?
Yeah, I mean that is a substantial portion of his work, because again, his basis for the state starts and his thoughts about human nature.
So how would you, if you had to describe humans as an animal, what do you think Hobbes would think that they were?
I mean, I wouldn't know. Wolves, maybe?
Yeah, wolves was actually the first thing that came to my mind, right? Kind of shrewd, would definitely kill you. Hungry.
But it's not? What does he think they are?
No, that was just an opinion question.
Oh, okay.
I was looking for your deep thoughts. And
yeah.
And apparently we're both so smart and just selected wolf. So
I mean, I guess that's what humans are, except we're probably not as good at killing until you give us technology.
I'm probably like a squirrel.
Yeah, I could see that. So humans are wolves. They suck. But because we're also, terrible, but also self-interested and rationally self-interested at that, we kind of recognized that the state of like constantly killing each other was not particularly great. And so people were just like, well, hey, I think it would be best if we sort of just like, didn't stop killing everyone. But there's no reason to expect that we would all just sort of mutually agree to all just suddenly stop, fighting and killing everyone. So instead, we choose to submit to the authority of a sovereign in the context of a civil society for the purposes of securing natural law, or in this case, our lives and liberty, and our ability to live without being constantly mauled and attacked by other people. And there are really two things that we do to one another when we enter into the social contract. The first is that we sort of renounce collectively the rights that we had in a state of nature. And Martin was talking about this earlier. So like the right to like murder whoever you want. And the second thing that we do is that we imbue somebody, be it one person or a group of persons, with the authority and power to enforce the initial contract. And this, the initial contract being simply the like collective agreement that we had to like stop killing each other. And so this is what makes Hobbes really different from a lot of the other social contract theorists, because he thinks basically authoritarianism is good, that we should give as much possible power to a government that, by the way, we can't rebel against, because Hobbes thinks that rebellion is really not okay, with the power to basically control all of our lives for the sole purpose of preventing us from attacking one another and reverting back to a state of war. So for Hobbes,
well, so mostly, although I just want our listeners to remember that for Hobbes, the thing that has ultimate power is the sovereign, not necessarily the government. So if the government was doing things that did not, end up protecting the security of the people in the long run, the people, like the government no longer has sovereign authority, and the people can get rid of it, replace it with a new one.
Perhaps, but Hobbes's threshold for rebellion is incredibly high, that he basically writes that you're just like basically never justified in resisting the sovereign's power.
Right.
Yeah.
But the idea is that thing has ceased to be the sovereign at that point. So.
Yeah. So that's the general idea behind Hobbes. I'll briefly highlight a few sort of issues that people bring up with Hobbes and sort of ways to get around them. The first obvious question is like, how do we check the power of a sovereign that is so powerful that it can literally do whatever it wants with your lives? Because you, being the rational, self-interested person that you are, have basically given over all of your freedom to a sovereign. What do we do about that? So Hobbes has, I guess, two answers here. The first is that, like, look, as bad as it can get, it's definitely not worse than the state of war. Like, a state of war is just ultimately the worst thing ever. Like, you should be so lucky as to like live in a steel cage and be fed gruel occasionally in the bottom of Martin's house, as to rather than like go back to a state of war. You should be happy about that. And second, Hobbes thinks that no matter how powerful the sovereign becomes, he'll always, and he uses the term he because we're writing back in like the many hundreds of years ago, but he, the sovereign, will always be checked by sort of the collective strength of the people, that no matter how strong the sovereign is, that they would never rationally against its own population, because its own population collectively is strong enough to check the power of the sovereign. And so that sort of takes care of the first concern that people raise against Hobbes about, what about this all-powerful, all-knowing sovereign that could do whatever it wants? And the second issue that a lot of people will sort of take with Hobbes is sort of his like really pessimistic view on human nature. And to that, Hobbes is just like, refer back to my writings. I think it's pretty clear humans suck. So.
Yeah, and obviously Hobbes's theories of human nature are heavily influenced by his time in the English Civil War. But another thing is that there are, and this is going to segue pretty well into our next thinker. But one of the things about Hobbes that we've said is, so Hobbes does not think that there is really morality or justice in the state of nature.
Yeah.
He thinks that morality and justice are only things that exist when a sovereign exists, and that you kind of don't have any pre-existing moral concerns, which is why, by the way, he's a pretty good philosopher for debate, because he's like very cut and dry. He's very exclusive of other types of philosophy. Your opponent says, hey, I listened to Martin and Lawrence's and Catherine Kenny's utilitarianism episode. Here's my theory of utilitarianism, or here's my theory of deontology. And you can be like, no. Those moral theories, those things are not moral in themselves. They're only moral because of the sovereign. In the state of nature, no morality. And I think that one of the things that Hobbes thinks about that is that morality and justice only make sense if you're able to kind of like follow through and execute on those things. And in the state of nature, since there's no one to enforce anything, you just don't have a moral, a moral basis for any rights. So, and this is a direct contrast to our next thinker. It's not that people have morals that are kind of being denied in the state of nature. It's that there just aren't any morals at all, and that's the problem. There are no rights, and that's the problem. And getting out of the state of nature was one way to get rid of that. Now, our next thinker is John Locke. Now, Locke thinks something a little differently about rights and how they work with respect to the state of nature.
Yeah, so there's a few key differences in Locke. The general theory, I guess, is the same, which is like we came out of a state of nature, agreed to like live in harmony and peace, and yay, society. But the first, I guess, major difference is sort of Locke's conception of natural rights. And this, so yeah, Locke says that we have these natural rights to life, liberty, and property. It should sound familiar. The United States, for example, uses the term life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which we basically just straight ripped off from Locke. And Locke says that we have these God-given, inalienable rights that we have by virtue of us being like children of God, first, basically. Whereas Hobbes, on the other hand, is like, these rights don't exist in the state of nature. They're merely people have preferences in the state of nature, but they don't have rights. And Locke disagrees with that. I guess the second major point of difference from Locke and Hobbes is his view on human nature. So Hobbes is like super pessimistic. Like everyone just wants to kill each other, and everyone, like, it's indistinguishable from a state of war. The state of nature is a state of war, and Locke thinks that isn't really the case. I think partially influenced by his sort of biblical roots, in which he can imagine like an Adam and Eve type world in which people like did kind of get along. But he thinks that the state of nature, which is a time prior to the government, is distinct from a state of war, which is where rights are constantly violated. Locke actually thinks that a state of nature was more or less fine, and that people naturally want to coexist peacefully with each other. People don't naturally want to kill each other, and that people are on balance net good. And so that you could actually probably live in a state of nature fine. But the reason that Locke thinks that a state of nature is less than optimal is because occasionally it creates the opportunities for other people's property to get violated or stolen or abused. And occasionally a state of nature can devolve into a state of war, where people want to constantly fight with each other and kill each other, and mostly over property disputes. And that is why he thinks that we should form a government. Not because if we don't, we'll all die, but because forming a government would be slightly more optimal for rectifying competing claims to various natural rights that you have. So, for example, one person's life versus another person's liberty, and mostly property disputes, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there are rights disputes that exist in the state of nature. Things aren't always that bad, but sometimes they get bad, so you need someone that can kind of be an objective party and enforce the dispute.
Right.
And that person is sovereignty. And my just very basic level understanding of Locke, and I have not read the Treatises of Government in some time, but the general idea is that for Hobbes, no one has any rights in the state of nature, and that's bad because you aren't protected from doing anything. But for Locke, you do have rights in the state of nature. They are natural rights you have naturally. And as a result of you having those rights, the problem in the state of nature is that those rights get violated, which is a moral harm. And creating a sovereign that can sort of administer a state is the best way to minimize those violations of your natural rights.
Yeah, and I'll take it one step further. It's not only just violations of sort of property rights, because Locke thinks that those are sort of the most basic sort of rights conflicts to some degree. It's adjudicating how to administer justice in a post-rights violation, which is why we need an objective evaluator or adjudicator, like a judge and government, to objectively decide, hey, you like violated this person's property rights, to what punishment should be rendered upon you. Without that sort of objective agreed to third-party arbitrator, like the government, that those sort of punishments become very arbitrary because you could just be like, oh, you like stole like 5 of my berries, I'm going to murder you. That seems like a little bit, over the top. So we need a
What
neutral
if they're
party.
blackberries?
Murder is like, is getting off easy in my mind if that's the case. But yeah, so you need a neutral third-party arbitrator to tell us how to settle, like once rights have been violated, what do we do about that as well? So it's not just to minimize violations, but it's also to deal with what happens after those violations occur.
Yeah, I mean, Hobbes. So like Hobbes is very much like a sort of like guy you can imagine just like sitting on his lawn, where like English kids are just like kicking dirt around over his like random blades of grass, and he's shaking the cane, shouting at him. He's like, "Oh, you kids, right? Like, oh, if I could only throw you in jail." Like for Hobbes, like throwing people in jail is like that's like one of the main purposes of a government. Like you think of like a very like the penal system when you think of Hobbes. It's like governments have to enforce stuff against other government or against the people in society, make sure that no one's getting up to no good. If they are up to no good, they get punished. And with Locke, you really think of kind of like a very courtroom situation, right? Like someone walks up to a judge and is like, "He stole my cow," and then the other guy's like, "Yeah, but you didn't pay me rent," or something. And then like the government's trying to like figure out like how to best minimize the violations of rights or whatever. It's just like those are the different images you get of thinking about the way that these people like the government. Like Locke is just like, yes, adjudicate this dispute,
right?
And then Hobbes is like, get in that cage, get in there. No, bad.
And I think like an obvious example of where their philosophies differ, that would sort of give off that image, is the views on revolution or revolting against the sovereign or the authority. So Hobbes is like, basically under no circumstances can you revolt against the sovereign. The sovereign is there to prevent you from reverting to a state of war. I don't care how much your life sucks, you kind of have to live under it. Locke, on the other hand, is like, well, the very justification for entering into a government was not to prevent us from devolving into a state of war. Our justification was to protect our property, and that if a government begins to become a threat to our property rights because it is too tyrannical and is unchecked and is doing things that hurt ultimately the rights of all citizens, well, then they have violated the very basis of the social contract that has been formed. Therefore, you have every right to revolt against an illegitimate government that disrespects property rights. So, in Hobbes's world, you have the harsh prison state that just throws you in jail because it can, and in Locke's, you have a much more American version of a government that we would sort of think is justifiable and is much more like nice to people and is much more legitimate, I guess, as most people would see it, and most people would see it today.
Now, most social contract arguments that you see in debate are kind of like weird hybrids of Hobbes and Locke, and like that's okay. But one thing you now hopefully you can get by in debate with basically a working knowledge of Hobbes' social contract, working knowledge of Locke's social contract, and a very detailed understanding of the basic tenets of them. Now, we're going to discuss a different social contract theorist who's a little more obscure. Lawrence, what do you think about Rousseau's social contract? Sort of, how does he differ from these other people? I know, for example, that Rousseau's opinion of the state of nature is not the same as Hobbes or Locke.
Yeah, so I have a list of some of the things that Rousseau differs on. I'll just go through them real quick because Rousseau's interesting, but like I would definitely not as important to understand as Hobbes or Locke. First is that Rousseau actually wrote 2 different versions of the social contract, one of which he is descriptive, which he thinks is like a historical analysis of social contracts that have existed. And then he wrote a second one as an essay that was like, here is what I think the social contract ought to look like. The second main difference is Locke loves property. He's like, property is awesome. Everything that you like mix your labor with becomes yours. That is yours to own. That is like the ultimate right that you have. You should not violate other people's property rights. It's not cool. Whereas Rousseau is like, well, we were all peaceful in the state of nature. Like we were all equal, like life was great. But then the problem was that people began to get jealous of each other. And that jealousy sort of leads to social divisions and makes life a lot worse to live in for everyone in that society. And that problem got significantly worse once the concept of private property was introduced, because that allowed people to materially see, well, that person has 10 cows, and they own those 10 cows, and I only have 2 cows, and that sucks because I want to own 10 cows. I don't want to own 2. And that leads to, huge social rifts. And these initial conditions of inequality just get larger and larger, and that really sucks. So people start realizing, hey, I don't really like this inequality. What do we do about it? So they form a government to attempt to restore initial conditions of equality and protect everyone. Now, the problem is that this is where Rousseau talks about his sort of descriptive contract, the contract that does happen. The problem that Rousseau says is that, well, what happens is that it doesn't end up protecting equality. It ends up just protecting the property of the rich, and that's problematic. So Rousseau's like, here's where we're going to get a little bit different. And instead of like creating a government that worsens inequality by protecting the property of the well-off, we should create a general pact that follows the general will. So it's like a weird concept. Like, what do you know about the general will?
I mean, my understanding is that it's sort of similar to the sovereign, but I really don't know very much about it.
Okay, so
just
yeah,
like
basically,
just like in the sense that it's just like a vague sort of incorporeal corporate body that is supposed to represent the people.
So basically, it's where people sort of collectively renounce individual rights that they have, and they transfer those rights to a collective body or a new person, and this is the sovereign. And this is where free and equal persons come together. They agree to become part of this single body, and it's the only purpose of this body is to be directed for the good of all, and that is the general will, which is the common good that everyone agrees and understands and will follow. And like other versions of the social contract, it's like there's reciprocal, like duties and like benefits that you get and stuff like that. But the main difference with other versions of the social contract, so for example, Hobbes is authoritarian because everyone just gives up their rights to the sovereign, and the sovereign can do whatever they want. Locke is like democratic because we all just sort of elect a government that respects the property rights of all. For Rousseau, it's direct democracy. It's not any of those other things. It's like everyone has to participate in government, and you all have to be part of it. Otherwise, it can't truly reflect the general will. And I guess this is probably the biggest problem with Rousseau, is that it really only works for small societies. Like it is impossible for a country with 320 some million people in it to be a direct democracy. So that's why Rousseau is like very idealized. And that we should have very small societies that reflect the general will, that have direct democracy, and that is what the social contract ought to look like.
Yeah, my understanding of Rousseau's social contract is really not super detailed. The basic thing that as I understand it, the most important thing is just is that Rousseau's opinion of the state of nature is a little different. State of nature, it's like Rousseau is a lot more interested in things like capitalism and property distribution inequality than like Hobbes and Locke are.
Yeah.
So if you have a topic that deals a little more explicitly with those sorts of things, then maybe Rousseau can help.
Yeah. Yeah, Rousseau's like definitely interesting. I've like heard some people in Oklahoma like read him in the past, but it's relatively difficult to understand.
I think the last time I heard a case about the Rousseau social contract was the first tournament I debated in.
Oh my, that's like what, 35 years ago?
At least 42.
Okay, dang.
All right, well, when we return, we'll talk about debating the social contract in all of its forms and the various ways that you can use it. Now, there are two ways that you can use the social contract in a very general sense. The first is as a framework argument, and there's two specific ways that you can do it as a framework argument. And the first is as its own framework. And I definitely, I can speak for Lawrence, but I can definitely speak for myself. I've seen a lot of frameworks of just like Locke's social contract theory or Hobbes's social contract theory or the social contract or some weird, a bunch of words that just mean the social contract,
Yeah, I've had some like long criterion like phrases like respecting the rights guaranteed by the social contract or something like that.
Wow, that's just why.
I don't know. It's like I don't know.
You
I can't.
You put guaranteed in the criterion.
Oh, that's
That would be like
that'd
be like respecting the morality of the categorical imperative.
That's a good point. I'm not sure if I used that phrase specifically. I just remember one of
Getting
my like
all of
criteria
the
super
happiness.
long.
Getting all of the virtues that utilitarianism garners.
Yeah, exactly.
That's my criteria. Stacking the deck.
As long as it's consistent with the deontology, just add that last part in there.
Yeah. Maximizing benefits to be consistent with deontology, virtue ethics, and Hobbes's social contract is my criterion.
Yep.
And then just with no explanation. It's just like contention one. If you want to troll Lawrence, that's what you should do if you have him as a judge. So, I know I've already asked you this. Are you going to be at CFL? Are you going to be at CFL Nats?
I will not be.
Dang it!
I like really actually want to go. Like, if someone wants to like buy my plane ticket to like CFL Nationals for this weekend, like I'll do it. But I looked at the hired judge website and it was not very enticing. Like it would barely have covered tickets.
Yeah, and you definitely should not call a card because you would be fined. So don't do that. How this is actually just pure ignorance. How far is Oklahoma from Kentucky? It's probably longer than I think it is. Like 5 hours ish drive. Longer?
I would guess longer.
Probably longer.
13 hours.
Whoa! So I guess I have zero idea where Oklahoma is.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
I mean, it's the middle of nowhere, so just take the distance from the middle of nowhere to Kentucky, which is like the right of nowhere.
the right of nowhere, Kentucky. That's a great quote, Lawrence. Kentucky is the right of nowhere. That's awesome. Anyway, back to debate. By the way, if any of you see me at the CFL National Tournament, feel free to say hi. I will probably, if it's between rounds, be playing Nintendo games with my children in some corner. But if you find me, feel free to say hi, even if I don't know you. Be like, hey, I listened to the podcast, and we'll be like, hey, how's it hanging, my man/woman? That's what I'll say. So if you want to elicit that response from me, you should hit me up. Okay, so as its own framework. Now, one thing to realize is that the social contract, when you're reading it as its own framework, is kind of like it can be kind of impact inclusive, right? Like there's a lot of things that can be said to relate to the social contract on the contention level. So one strategy is to read it as its own framework, so that you can allow like a multiplicity of different types of contentions to link into one criterion. Or am I wrong about that? Lawrence, what do you think about reading the social contract theory as an inclusive criterion or as an exclusive one?
It seems relatively difficult to read it as a super exclusive one, because it seems like most arguments would at least matter somewhat underneath a theory of government like the social contract. So I mostly just read it as inclusive. Like it cared about virtually every impact that you could imagine. It did give higher weight to certain arguments, but I don't think I ever read it as an exclusive criterion.
Yeah, I enjoy the social contract theory arguments, and if you're competing at CFL Nationals this weekend, social contract theory arguments maybe are a good idea because they have a pretty good pedigree. A lot of people kind of understand on the basis like what they are, so it could be a good place to demonstrate mastery. Spoiler alert. Okay, and So the next way you can use it in the framework, as I already mentioned, is as a warrant for a different framework. Now, if you want to listen to an episode where we go in detail about how the social contract might be used in favor of utilitarianism or deontology, you guys should look up the utilitarianism and deontology episode with Catherine Kenny. That episode's really good, like basic philosophical primer on util and deont, and it goes into depth on how the social contract can be used to justify lots of various things. And one of the things that we mentioned on that episode is that it is pretty easy to at least say a warrant for an argument that sounds like it's a social contract warrant. Like, it's pretty easy to spin the social contract arguments to justify various frameworks. And a lot of funny rounds that I see are where debaters are trying to use the social contract both in wrong and different ways to try to matter under their framework. Have you noticed that, my friend?
Not really, but that may also be because I don't pay attention during rounds.
Oh wow, Pref Lawrence, everyone. Or just naturally get him at a tournament without Pref / CFL Nats. So yeah, there's a lot of criterions that have to do with rights, by the way, have an interesting relationship with the social contract. And in general, the social contract is a very good framework warrant for resolutions that are about the interaction between the government and the people, because it is a pretty concise description of a working relationship between the government and the people. Like, the government should do this for the people should do this to the government. A lot of those things, the social contract is uniquely good for those topics, and for as both their own criterion warrants, but also as philosophical theories that have to do with the government sort of being the agent of action. And the last thing, and this is going to be a fairly short section, is about the contention. Now, this is kind of if you have a framework that is already social contract-y, but there are some cases where you can make contention arguments that have to do a lot with the social contract theory. Did we talk? So I see the section in our notes for rights forfeiture. Did we talk generally about like rights forfeiture, like what that was?
I don't believe we used that term explicitly, no, so maybe talk about it anyways.
Yeah, very quickly. We already mentioned this concept earlier on in the podcast, but rights forfeiture is the idea that you give it's not just the general thing where you give up some rights to the government, but it also means that if a citizen breaks their end of the contract, they kind of forfeit a lot of the rights that they already had against the government doing bad stuff to them. So, for example, if I go on a killing spree, right, I stab all of Lawrence's family, and then the government's like, okay, we're throwing you in this prison, and then so to be clear, the government is not allowed to throw you in prison whenever it wants. That would be a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights, as well as like maybe your Eighth Amendment rights too. That's just in the United States, but really, like in the vast majority of good, well-meaning countries, doing that stuff is bad. So as a consequence of that, not as a consequence, but if you break your end of the contract, the government, can do some stuff to try to safeguard the people that involves breaking some of those rights. So if you, stab 100 people, the government's like, we're throwing you in prison. You can't be like, oh, my rights. The idea is that you forfeited those rights. And as a result of your unlawful actions, you've broken your end of the social contract, which is to, not. So you remember social contract, like you give up your positive rights. The idea is that you didn't, so therefore you don't have like really negative rights either.
Yeah.
And, a lot of these philosophers differ on like how much rights you give up. So like, obviously, like if I steal a gummy bear, the government can't like imprison me for life and start torturing me. It's not like you forfeit all your rights instantly. There's some degree of proportionality to it. But the idea is that you give up some of your rights when you break your end of the deal. And the government is allowed to do unpleasant things to you that wouldn't ordinarily be able to deal. So I remember I had a couple topics that I debated where like rights forfeiture was an argument, where it's like, I think it was like there was like a death penalty topic, and it's like the death penalty happens, and people are like, don't give me the death penalty. And part of the argument is like, you did a really heinous thing, you have forfeited your rights. So whatever, I'm not saying that argument was good, but social contract does allow contention arguments.
Yeah. Maybe some just general tips for debating with a social contract then.
Yeah, sure. What you got?
So, I mean, I feel like this is said every single time, but just strong, in-depth knowledge about each of the social contract philosophers, and specifically the ones you choose to deploy, I think really is the single best tip we can give you. Like, don't just rely on this introduction podcast episode to the social contract. You should read summary articles from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You should read some of the original works. You should, Victory Briefs, for example, sells textbooks that contain edited portions of the original works of these books with annotations that help you guide you through the reading here. Read as much as you can to really understand each of these social contract philosophies, because the more that you know, the better off you're going to be. I remember one time, my sophomore year, I believe, this was, I believe, the very, very awful domestic violence topic. But I mostly just debated the social contract on both sides of this, and sort of talked about how the relation of individuals to other individuals in an instance where the government may have failed to intervene. And a lot of these debates, other people were also reading the social contract, and I was winning most of these debates because I was the only one in that room who had read the original works of these social contract debates, or of these social contract authors. And so really understanding the nuances and the individual aspects of each of these social contract philosophers really helps you win. The second thing I would guess that I would recommend is to sort of understand how holistic of a moral theory that this is, and that they can't really account for every possible instance of a rights conflict, because Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau can only tell you sort of the generalized theory behind what a government ought to do when rights conflict, but they don't give you an answer in sort of every single instance, and especially in the specific instance of the resolution. I think the NCFL's topic is about secrecy and the right to know, and the NSDA's nationals topic is about liberty versus security. Well, to what extent do these things get balanced against each other? Well, that requires just a lot of your own critical thinking and application of these social contract philosophies to that particular instance, and really understanding the basis behind these works, which I guess, again, ties into my first point. Knowing about the social contract is the best thing that you can do for debating this.
All right. Well, with that strong advice on our hands, let's move into our end segment. Well, that's our episode for this week. Send us an email at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com with any questions you might have, or gripes about how I pronounce your name if your name is Hobbes, or Loke. Feel free to do all the Victory Briefs things. Thanks again to Victory Briefs for sponsoring the podcast. You all are great. Leave us an iTunes review. Check us out on Facebook. Check us out on SoundCloud. Check us out on the iTunes page. Just search for The Argument Clinic. You should be able to find us. Okay, so now on to the mini debate for this week. This one's pretty stupid, but
Aren't they all?
That's not true. Best Berry was an excellent discussion. Okay, so I'm gonna go this time with woodland creatures. So best woodland creature. So this is defined as you imagine in some sort of fantasy world that there are these places with trees that aren't that tall, and there are things that live there and stuff that are not people. And I think that there are a bunch of legitimate choices for woodland animals. I am going to choose fox.
Dang it.
We're going to choose fox. I'm prepared to choose a different one. Wait, no.
You can stick with fox. I'll just pick
Show no
one.
fear. Show no fear. I didn't take the most obvious one.
Okay.
But so I'm going to choose fox because foxes are smart, and I like smart things. foxes are like very like attractive as well. They're like very, very pretty creatures. There's an entire YouTube video sensation from somewhere in Scandinavia of someone inquiring, what does the fox say? So I think that's so they're an important pop culture phenomenon. They they are a metaphor in the English language that just means like smart or good or sly or witty or evasive. So I think fox has a lot of attributes going for it in best woodland animal. All right, Lawrence, what is your counter suggestion?
So wolf, perhaps.
Wolf is not like a woodland creature. What are you saying?
I don't know. It says that it is. Okay, fine. How about a skunk? Can I do a skunk?
You're allowed to do a skunk.
Okay, I'm going for the skunk. Its defense mechanisms are, I think, the best thing that evolution has to show for. It's so simplistic and so effective that we've all associated the skunk, despite it not even being particularly deadly, with just being the worst thing that you could possibly imagine. So it's super effective from an evolutionary standpoint. I think it looks, it looks fine. It reminds me of myself a lot, particularly in its terrible looks.
All of the white stripes, you mean?
Yeah, that is basically me during the summer when I wear shorts and you pull them up and you can see the white stripe, where my short line is. Let's see, and that's about all I got. But they smell really bad.
So I'm gonna go hard for the viral sensation argument.
Oh, you're going for the viral sensation advantage? All right, let's put some defense against this. It's not a viral sensation
anymore. This policy debate?
No one cares. No one cares about what did the fox say. I actually think that's a mark against the fox that it was part of such a terrible song.
That song is actually not that bad. It's very catchy, actually.
It was catchy the first 3 times, and then it made me want to
I listened to
like strangle. It made me want to strangle like foxes after I kept on hearing it.
I think that song is eloquent. So the word skunk, like if you describe a human as a skunk, that literally just means like a thing that is bad.
I'm okay with that.
But fox is like a thing that is good. That's good. Also, is like all that skunks have going for them is that they have like an odious fart.
Yeah.
Like foxes like steal hens from like chicken coops or whatever, just like really in like a very, very like sneaky way. They're like super smart. Skunks aren't smart, they just have gas.
All right, I think I agree with your original statement that this was in fact a stupid mini debate, and I will concede to you that a fox is better than a skunk.
Hey, it was your fault you picked skunk. You could have look, dude. Squirrel is just like obviously the right selection, but
yes, I guess.
But see, I just didn't select squirrel to give you an advantage. It's even debate related. Come on, I even own apparel with squirrels on it. I actually do. That's a true story.
That sounds like a mark against squirrels.
A mark against squirrels that Martin's wearing them. That makes sense. Makes sense. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode for this week. Again, send us any emails if you have questions. Hope you enjoy. Hope you can use this knowledge to your success at any tournament where you have to discuss the social contract. And Lawrence, which is the opposite. So stay frosty.
An argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.